Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try out a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With the launch of their managed Kubernetes platform, it's easy to get started with the next generation of deployment and scaling, powered by the battle-tested Linode platform, including simple pricing, node balancers, 40 gigabit networking, dedicated CPU and GPU instances, and worldwide data centers. Go to pythonpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. You listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For more opportunities to stay up to date, gain new skills, and learn from your peers, there are a growing number of virtual events that you can attend from the comfort and safety of your own home. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to check out the upcoming events being offered by our partners and get registered today. Your host, as usual, is Tobias Macy. Today I'm interviewing Attila Tóth about doing data extraction with web scraping. So, Attila, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey, Tobias. Yeah, thanks for having me. First of all, I work as a technology evangelist at ScrapingHub, which is a company that does web data extraction. My job is really to just educate people about web scraping, both technical people and business people, how to do web scraping, what is web scraping, what are the challenges associated with web scraping. You know, it can be useful for people, useful for businesses. That's what I mainly do.
And in terms of speaking to those different audiences, what have you found to be some of the most common points of confusion and some of the changes in the way that you need to discuss the subject matter to help them out and make sure that it's the right solution for them?
In my experience with web scraping, the one thing that always comes up is, which we will probably talk about later, is the legal issues. Like, is web scraping legal? That always comes up. And another problem which always comes up is when doing web scraping on a small scale is really easy to do, sort of. You just have a website, you want to grab some data, you write some code in Python or in some other languages using web scraping libraries, and it's really easy to do and it can be quick to do. But when you are trying to do things at scale and get huge amounts of data from the web consistently, that can be really hard to do. So there are a whole another set of challenges when you're trying to scale. In my experience, that's what a lot of people don't know when they start web scraping, especially when, many times people have just a hobby project that involves web scraping. Sometimes it's, to help them with sports betting or just monitoring a website, any kind of hobby project. And then they try to scale that for not just as a hobby, but for business purposes. And then they realize that, it's not that easy actually to scale web scraping. They will experience a lot of difficulties doing that. So yeah, I guess that those are the two things. The one is the legal stuff with web scraping, and the other is how hard it is really to scale up.
Do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, of course. Before Python, actually, I was programming in Java. I was developing Android applications in Java. Also, I had a lot of hobby projects, minor things that help me with automations. For example, I had one of these projects that involved web scraping. And at the time, it was 2015. I didn't know much about web scraping. So I did a research and I found this library called Scrapy, which isn't written in Java. It's a Python library or a Python framework. So basically, Scrapy was the entry point for me because that's the reason I started to learn Python, to learn Scrapy. And then I found that Python is much more better suited to do analysis, data analysis kind of work, which I was really interested in. So I just switched to Python from Java.
And in terms of web scraping itself, can you give a bit more of a description about what it is and some of the reasons that you might want to use web scraping as opposed to using an API or pulling data from some sort of data dump or database?
So there are many use cases for web scraping. The reason I really love web scraping because it can be really useful for individuals, for programmers, or really anyone who can code and wants to automate a job, automate anything on the web, or get some kind of data from the web if the website doesn't have an API. Because really, if the website doesn't have an API, normally you cannot really do anything except copy and paste the data, but that's not feasible in many cases. So you have web scraping. But also on the business side, on large scale projects, it can be useful as well to, for example, web scraping is huge in the e-commerce world, where e-commerce companies monitor prices of the competitors. And they do it daily. They extract the prices, they compare the prices, they run price analysis on the data. And because of web scraping, they are able to better price their products. Or another use case, which is a similar use case, is in the real estate market. For example, I have a friend right now who is looking for a house. He's looking to buy a house, but currently the prices on the market, at least where he lives, is really high. And so he's having a hard time finding a good house to buy. So he's set up a scraper, which scrapes some of the major real estate sites daily. It sends an email to him if there is a house which he should look at. So that's another interesting use case. On the business side of things, it's also useful for lead generation. Like when there's a website with a bunch of company contact information, you can do a one-time scraping to get contact information, and it can be useful to prospect people. So these are the general use cases. There are many others, like scraping news, for example, like news articles. Generally speaking, I would say that one way to use web scraping is to just grab the data and then you get value immediately. Like you can maybe export it as a spreadsheet or a CSV file and you can look at the data, and that's useful at that stage. But on another level, if you run some kind of analysis, or some companies do different NLP stuff on the text data, and then they are building on top of web scrape data. And so that's another way you can get value from web scraping.
And in your experience, what was it that first got you involved in web scraping and that keeps you interested in the space to the point where you're acting as a technical evangelist for a company that is built entirely around that subject area?
So it all started for me with a hobby project. In the past, I was really into sports betting. But I really didn't do it for the money, because I just wasn't that good. But I enjoyed the research. I enjoyed looking into stats, and I enjoyed coming up with different strategies to bet on football. I wanted to create a software that does the research for me. A software that would have, first of all, data, football data, historical stats. And then it would analyze data and give me suggestions, what game or what match I should bet on. Here, my very first problem was that I didn't have any data. I didn't have sports data. And at the time, there weren't many open source or open data sets. I was looking for a data set for multiple months, but I couldn't really find anything except really high-priced data sets that are for companies, not individuals. But I realized that there are websites where you can actually see the data, like it's there in the HTML. You can see it in tables, so you can physically see it. But there is no API to the website. So I figured that there must be a way to get this data from the HTML into a SQL database or something. And basically, this is how I came across web scraping first. And I developed my first scraper in Java using the JSoup library, which is really popular for people who do web scraping in Java. I also used later on for more difficult websites, I used, HTML unit, which is used for testing. I think it's similar to Selenium in Java, but I used it to execute JavaScript because some websites need JavaScript to work properly. And if you don't render JavaScript, they won't show you the data. But anyway, I then switched from Java to Python to learn Scrapy and to do web scraping with Scrapy. I built this sports betting application with the help of Scrapy, or at least Scrapy helped me to get the data from websites. And that's when I really started to like web scraping, because I realized that, it was just a silly hobby project, although I really liked it. But without web scraping, I wouldn't have been able to get the data. That was the big thing for me, that without web scraping, I couldn't have started this project at all, because I wouldn't have been able to get the data.
And you mentioned Scrapy being the tool that you have settled on as the most useful for your use cases. And I know that it's also one of the more popular frameworks for web scraping in general, despite the fact that, as you said, there are options in other languages as well as other Python tools for it. So I'm wondering what it is about the Scrapy project itself and its community that has made it stand out and retain such widespread popularity.
I think Scrapy has a really good community because there are many other libraries in Python or in other languages, but most of the web scraping libraries are really only useful for parsing HTML. So because when you scrape the web, what you're doing essentially is downloading the HTML file, finding the data, finding the data fields or data points in the HTML, which you can do using CSS selectors or XPath or maybe regular expressions. Once you found the data, you extract it using the library, which can be Beautiful Soup or LXML or Scrapy or in JSoup, or there are many others. But the real value in Scrapy comes if you need to do something more with the data. You need to process it. And in real-world projects, usually you need to post-process the data, meaning that you need to clean it, you need to standardize it, normalize it, you need to store in some kind of database. So it's really not just grabbing the data from the HTML. And with Scrapy, there are a lot of features that make it easy for you to post-process the data and really do end-to-end web scraping inside Scrapy. Because if you wouldn't use Scrapy, you would need to sort of reinvent the wheel. You will need to come up with a way to sort of facilitate your whole web data extraction project. And in Scrapy, you have built-in modules that, for example, if you want to get the data in JSON, in Scrapy, there's a module called feed export, which exports your scrape data in a format you like JSON or maybe CSV. And it's just one line of code. Also, you have the pipelines that make it easy to store the data into a database. So yeah, I think the real value in Scrapy is when you need to post-process the data. And the situation is that you almost always need to post-process the data. At least you need to clean it. Because when you grab data from the HTML, it's probably messy. It's probably not standardized, especially if you are extracting data from multiple websites. You need to standardize it. And so Scrapy makes it easy to do these tasks.
And with Python in particular, there's the added benefit that you have easy access to all of the different data engineering tool chains and machine learning tool chains that people have built up around the numerical aspects of Python over the past couple of decades.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Especially, like I mentioned, many web scraping use cases are built around running some kind of analysis on the web script data. And as you said, once you get the data from Scrapy and it's in Python, you can just pass the data onto some other Python library like Pandas, for example, to do other data engineering stuff with it.
And in terms of web scraping itself, you already mentioned this earlier, is the idea of copyright and content ownership and the legality of web scraping. So I'm wondering, what are the main things that anybody who's interested in doing web scraping should be aware of in terms of the legality and issues around copyright ownership or attribution of the data?
So it's interesting because at ScrapingHub, we often do webinars for people, and this question always comes up in some shape or form. Is web scraping legal? How you can do it so it's legal? like there are some general guidelines about web scraping, which I'm going to share now. But ScrapingHub, we have a legal team that makes sure that everything what we are doing as far as web scraping is legal. And obviously, I'm not a lawyer. So what I'm going to say is not any kind of legal advice, but there are some general guidelines. So for example, it's important that web scraping itself is legal, but it really matters how you get the data, how polite you are while getting the data. And also, you mentioned copyright. It's important that what you do with the data after you scraped it. So with the first part, how polite you are when scraping a website, it's very easy with web scraping to ignore the rules that the website has and that you should follow. So for example, let's say you want to scrape a website, what you should do to make sure that you are being polite, because that's really important from a legal standpoint, but also from an ethical standpoint. So first of all, there is a file that is almost always available on websites, which is the robots text file. And when you're scraping the website, you should always follow the rules that are defined in the robots text file. So for example, if you want to be polite and the robots text file says that between two requests, you should have a delay of 3 seconds, for example, then you should put that delay between requests in your scraper. So the very first thing you could do to respect the website is to follow the rules defined in the robots text file. But generally, you just don't want to hit the website too hard, because if you hit the website too hard, there is a chance that it will go down, it will shut down, which is not good. You don't want to do that. You want to be polite and you want to respect the website so it can operate properly for everybody. And the other part is what you do with the data once you scraped it. And here it's really up to the specific use case, because for example, if you're scraping personal information, there is a high chance it has some kind of legal issues, or it might have because of GDPR. Or if you are scraping content like images or articles or some kind of content, you are republishing it. That can be a problem because of different legal issues. But it's not an issue because of the web scraping itself. Web scraping itself is legal, but once you got the data, obviously it does matter what you do with the data and how you use the data. And so that can be a problem.
And to that point, as you said, after you access the data, you need to do some processing on it, and you're likely to perform some analysis. Or if you're trying to do this at scale, you might be loading it into a database or data warehouse and performing additional analyses or building some sort of product on top of it. So what are some of the considerations for storing and processing that data that we should be thinking of, both from the technical and the legal aspects?
So from the legal side of things, I cannot talk much about it because I'm not a lawyer, but from the technical standpoint, there is a difference when you're doing things small scale or large scale. So when you're scraping the web at a large scale, two of the problems that will take probably most of your time is the data quality, like keeping data quality high, and the other is maintaining the spiders. So there are many other things that we might mention later on, like unstructured data. Yeah, actually, let's talk about unstructured data, because with web scraping, you don't really have like a universal schema that every web scraper follows. Like there is not one schema that you need to follow if you are scraping a specific type of website. So it can be a challenge when you are figuring out how to store the data, like what kind of data fields you need, how you name those data fields. So first you need to figure out the schema, like what data points you really need and how it makes sense to store the data long term. But once you have that, it's really just a challenge to keep the data quality high. Because if the data quality is too low, like we mentioned products or use cases where people build on top of web scrape data. Even though it's really useful to grab the data, run analysis on it, and based on the analysis, companies usually make better decisions and that sort of thing. But if the data quality is low, the kind of decisions that you can, or analysis that you can run on low quality data is just, it's not a good situation when you have low quality data and you're trying to run analysis on the low quality data. And with web scraping, it's really easy to get bad quality data because let's say you have a spider, you have selectors that select the data from on the website, but website changes its layout. And so from one day to another, you will not be able to get the data because the website has a different layout and your selectors don't work anymore and data quality drops. And so you need to maintain the spiders. And if you're building on top of WebScript data, for example, in the e-commerce world, we have different use cases like, for example, price intelligence, which basically means that you extract prices and you run analysis on the prices. And you monitor competitors, or you monitor your own product prices, or you monitor the whole market. And if the price data that comes out of your web scraping project is low quality, you will not be able to drive decisions based on the data. So that's one consideration to sort of work on, is to how to keep the data quality high. So that's one reason why data quality could drop, because of site maintenance or because the website layout changes and you need some time to maintain the spider, but also because scraping websites at scale, you need to use proxies. You need to use a lot of proxies in many large-scale web scraping projects. That's the majority of the work, to manage proxies, getting a healthy proxy pool, and making sure that you can make successful requests. Meaning that you can get the HTML file in the first place and then extract the data with your spiders. If you cannot make successful requests, you don't get the HTML files. And so this can cause the data quality to drop.
And in terms of the data quality aspects that you mentioned, there is the issue of sites changing their layouts or actively trying to prevent web scraping that can lead to breakages once you've got something that's functioning and then needing to maintain it. And then also, as you mentioned, the issues around trying to scale a scraper to be able to maintain the data on a periodic basis or collect data from multiple sites. So I'm wondering, what are some of the ways that people who are writing a scraper can guard against some of those changes and updates, or ways to allow the scraper to adapt to those changes?
I would say that you should have a way to learn quickly if there's a layout change. With Scrapy, for example, you have a lot of open source modules that you can use alongside with Scrapy that help you keep the data quality high, that alerts you that, hey, there is something wrong. Maybe you should have a look at this website because maybe it changed the layout. But there is not really like a shortcut. Like if the website layout changes, you need to change the selectors. And when it, for one website, it's really easy to do, but for hundreds or thousands of websites, you will have a lot of maintenance work. But the good news is that there are, just like in many other industries, in web scraping as well, there are machine learning advancements. Like there are different AI-based tools that extract the data for you. So for example, at ScrapingHub, we have a product called Auto Extract, which is an ML-based tool which extracts the data fields from the page, and you only need to submit the type of the page. So for example, we have this API called Auto Extract News API, and what it basically does is that you submit, it's an API, and you submit the page URL, and you say that, hey, there is a news on this page, or there is an article on this page. And so the software will know that, what fields, what data points to look for, and it automatically extracts all the data fields that you care about from the HTML. And this is all ML based, so you don't need to manually find or locate the data points in the HTML. And this is huge because this way you don't need to maintain the spider if the website layout changes. Because if it changes, doesn't matter, the algorithm will locate the data fields anyway. So that's really the ultimate solution long term. We are doing this for many different data types. So for example, we have News API, which is for news and articles. We have a Product API, which is for e-commerce websites. meaning product pages. So you get all the data fields related to products like product price, stock information, product description, product name, and so on. So in the future, you will not need to deal with maintaining spiders. You will just need to specify that, hey, I want to scrape data from this page. This is a product page or a real estate listing or an article page, and give me all the data points. And the API will give you all the data points, and you won't need to struggle with, the selectors or XPath or whatever.
One of the other ways of scaling the collection of web data is by using proxies to help with things like access restriction, where there might be some sort of geo-IP blocking set up, or issues with the lack of a matching user agent that a site might set up. So I'm wondering if you can talk through some of the considerations of using proxies, when you might want to use them, and some of the features you should look at if you're trying to either select or implement a proxy yourself.
Yeah, so there are some reasons that you would want to or need to use proxies. One of them, just like you mentioned, if there is some kind of geo blocking that the website implemented, or if you want to get geo-specific data from the website, meaning that the website shows you a different page or different data based depending on where you are. So if, for example, in e-commerce, you might see a different price or different delivery or shipping information based on your location. And so in order to get this kind of data, you need to use geo-targeted proxies. The second reason why you would use proxies is when you're trying to scrape a lot of data regularly, consistently from a website, you will just not be able to get it from your computer or data center, because the website will realize that you are a bot and it will block you, even though what you're doing is ethical and you are making sure that you are polite. The website can still block you. With proxies, the interesting thing is that when people experience issues with the web scraping project, meaning that they start to experience blocks, most of the time they know that they need to use proxies, but many times it's not just the proxies itself. Like proxy itself is a commodity. Like you can buy proxies from many, many countries. You can buy different kinds of proxies, data center proxies, residential proxies. There are all kinds of proxies out there that you can buy. But with web scraping, if you want to be efficient, it's really about how you manage those proxies that you have. So let's say you are trying to scale up your project, you experience issues with data quality, you don't get successful requests, and you want to start using proxies. One solution that you could do is to just buy a bunch of proxies and just rotate them randomly. And that might work for a while, but that's definitely not an efficient way to do things. What I would say the best way to do it is to get proxies, but put a lot of consideration into how you manage those proxies. So for example, at ScrapingHub, we have a platform which is helping you with web scraping on all levels. You can run your spiders in the cloud. We provide these machine learning-based APIs. We have solutions, etc. But we also provide proxies. But the way we think about this is that what you really want is not really proxies. It's just a mean to an end. What you really want is successful requests. So what we give you is not just proxies, but a full proxy management solution. Yes, we have proxies, but the main thing is that how we manage the proxies for you. Like there are many tactics that you can use to manage the proxies in a smart way. So for example, a website might, block a proxy. One time it might block a proxy, but it doesn't mean that it will be blocked forever. So you can retry the proxy a day later, or a week later, or a month later, and it might work again. With smart proxy management, it's really about making use of your current proxies. Like usually the customers that come to us, they just don't want to deal with this whole proxy management thing. They just want a solution that gives them successful requests. Or we have customers who come to us because they started to or try to do it themselves. They try to manage the proxies themselves, but it just really became a headache. The thing with proxies is that, as the time goes on, it's not going to be easier. Like, it's just going to be harder. You just going to need to spend more time on the way you manage the proxies. And so for many companies, it just makes sense to outsource this thing, because you can get really bogged down managing proxies. And for many companies and for many people, it's not what they try to do. It's not the core of their business to do web scraping. It's just a way to get data. And so many people don't like to spend way too much time on proxies.
For people who are building web scrapers, particularly with Scrapy, but also just in the general case, what are some of the common pitfalls or sharp edges that they're likely to run into for building the scraper, collecting the data, and also for trying to scale that data collection?
I have a colleague that said last year at our summit, he said, the web is a jungle. So when you scrape the web, you really shouldn't expect to find, standardized websites. You shouldn't expect that websites follow the same practices. So one thing is that front-end developers or website developers have different ways to accomplish things. And when you're writing your spider, it can be really, really frustrating, or it can be hard to create really a custom web scraper for each website, because this website used this way to display data, the other website used some kind of other way to display the data. So it can be really hard. The other thing is, in my experience, I don't have data about this, but in my experience, people usually underestimate the effort they will need to get data from websites. And actually, I did this mistake. Before I joined ScrapingHub, I was building my own company, or I was a co-founder in a web scraping-based startup. And I did that mistake that it was easy to get data from, let's say, 10 websites. At the time, we were talking about maybe thousands of records per day, or maybe tens of thousands of records extracted per day. And that was fairly easy to do. I didn't need to use proxies, or I didn't need to use many proxies. There wasn't many maintenance work needed for 10 websites. But when we started to scale, it became really hard, because at the same time, we needed to maintain the spiders, because the layouts were changing. There was always some kind of work to do with the spiders. And on the proxy side, we needed to find some kind of solution to not get bogged down with the proxies. So those two things are really, I think if people start a new project, it's easy to underestimate those. It really comes down to a question of data quality when you're extracting data from the web. And there needs to be a process in place to make sure that the data quality is high, especially when you are building something on top of the web script data. For example, I mentioned price intelligence. In price intelligence softwares, the way it works is that there is a module that extracts data from websites. And, it can be thousands of websites or tens of thousands of websites. It stores the data in a database. And then there is an application that reads the data from the database. But if the data that comes out of the scraping module or the extraction code is low quality, or it's not standardized, or there is some issue with it, you will not be able to trust the results, the analysis that the price intelligence software gives you. And so on long term, I think data quality is the issue to focus on, and to make sure that you have a process in place. Also, I mentioned, that the web is really not standardized. When it comes to web data, there is not one straightforward schema that everyone is using. That's why I think solutions that sort of try to standardize this make sense. When we are talking about a product page, we have a clear and agreed upon schema that everyone will use to store data or to display data. And the same for other data types. Another consideration that we actually didn't talk about is JavaScript. When you're scraping the web, you sometimes need to render JavaScript, and it can be a challenge, because as far as resources, because if you need to render JavaScript, that's going to take more of your resources, and it's going to be probably more expensive, and you probably need to use some kind of tool that renders JavaScript, because, for example, the scraping libraries we mentioned don't render JavaScript. Also, Scrapy doesn't render JavaScript by default. So for this, you need to use, a tool like a headless browser like Selenium, or in JavaScript, many people use Puppeteer, or what I really like to use for JavaScript rendering is Splash, which is an open source JavaScript rendering solution, and it has a really great integration with Scrapy. So you can just, plug in Splash into your Scrapy and render JavaScript with Scrapy. And yeah, another pitfall maybe related to JavaScript rendering is that some websites has sort of hidden APIs, like JSONs that are getting passed around in the background that has the same kind of data that you want to scrape. And many times it makes sense to grab that JSON from the background. Like maybe the website uses Ajax to request these data files. And instead of relying on the HTML and relying on your spider to grab the data from the HTML, you can just grab the JSON and get structured data that way. This way, you don't even need to render JavaScript.
And in your experience of working on web scrapers yourself and working with people who are building them at ScrapingHub, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected ways that you've seen Scrapy and ScrapingHub used, and some of the particularly interesting or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
There are two categories of use cases. At least that's how I look at it. Like first, we have the individual use cases, meaning that use cases that are implemented by individuals for hobby projects or, simple automations. Like, for example, I recently heard about this person who created a scraper to find grocery delivery slots in an online store. Because, during COVID, everybody started to order online groceries and everything. That was the situation here, that you couldn't find open delivery slots. So you couldn't order online. But this person built a web scraper that monitored this website. And whenever there was an open delivery slot, it sent an email. So that's, I think, pretty useful. Or I mentioned my friend who is looking to buy a house, and he's monitoring the real estate prices. So that's one category of use cases. And the other category of use cases, which are also interesting in my opinion, is when you're building on top of WebScript data. Like, for example, I talked to this company not so long ago. They are like an NLP company, and they provide basically a search engine for news. So you can search news that are relevant for you. They monitor specific topics. So, for example, you might want to learn about, COVID vaccine development, and you monitor all the news related to that. And in the background, the software has a feature that lets you submit, news that, hey, this article is about the topic that I want to monitor. Here's another article that's also about the topic I want to monitor. And you basically train the system to monitor news that are relevant for you. So whenever you use the application, it will only show you news that are really relevant for you. So I found it really interesting. Another use case, which is, I guess it's not spectacular, but it's just really useful and it just really makes sense to do it, is to monitor prices on the web, right? Like really any prices. We have e-commerce, we have real estate as far as prices. There are huge web scraping projects in the automotive industry. When it comes to brand monitoring, it's actually called a minimum advertised price monitoring that brands use, which means that, a brand has a specific pricing policy, and distributors or the resellers need to align their prices with brand's policy. And with web scraping, these brands can monitor the reseller's website and get alerted if the price is, higher or lower than it's supposed to be. So yeah, but for me, the reason I love web scraping is that it's easy to do web scraping on small scale. Like I remember when I first learned about web scraping, I think it took me about, maybe 2 days or 3 days, probably 3 days, to write my first scraper and to actually see data coming out of my web scraper. and there are many use cases for individuals to just automate small tasks. But with for big companies, for large enterprises, it also makes sense to do web scraping at a large scale. So that's why I love it.
And are there any other aspects of web scraping and your experience at ScrapingHub that we didn't discuss that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
I think we covered the main things. Yeah.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. This week, I'm going to choose the band Government Mule. I may have picked them in the past, but it's just a really great rock band that I've enjoyed listening to for a number of years now. So if you're looking for some new music to listen to or some old music that you may be familiar with, definitely worth taking a look at that. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Attila. Do you have any picks this week?
Yeah, actually, yeah. So, it's not a new thing, but there's this open source. It's not like a library, but it's on GitHub. Awesome web scraping and awesome Scrapy, which has a lot of tools about web scraping and about Scrapy that, just makes it easy to get data from the web.
All right, I'll definitely have to take a look at those. So thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss your experience building web scrapers and working with ScrapingHub to help other people in their efforts on that front. So I appreciate all the time and effort you've put in, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you, Tobias. Thanks for having me. It was fun. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.